Hello, everybody. This is All Quiet on the Inner Front. I'm Alex Ray, and I'm very lucky today to be joined by Professor Jiang Xueqin, the star of predictive history and a very popular voice on YouTube these days, bringing new frameworks of understanding to the world of our past and the world around us at the present. Professor Jiang, I think your popularity in the last year, in particular, has really captured a lot of people's uh, understanding of the missing elements of history and the way we understand the world, particularly through your incorporation of psychological and spiritual nuances and elements in looking at human societies and human motivations. I think you briefly described this as psychohistory on the introduction in your channel. Um, could you tell us a little bit more about how you came to see this as a more nuanced and appropriate approach to history, as opposed to, I think, what the sort of status quo orthodox approach that many people would have grown up with in high school? And what are the extra nuanced elements of psychology and spirituality that you feel necessary to bring into any understanding of history?
Yeah, so it's a long story, but when I was growing up in Toronto, I was an immigrant child in Toronto. I didn't have that many friends, and I was bullied a lot. So I retreated into the library. I read a lot of books. I was a huge fan of science fiction. So my favorite, of course, was Isaac Asimov, the psychohistory. But I also read, Ray Bradbury, and I also love John Wyndham. The Day of the Triffids is one of my favorite books. Isaac Asimov, I absorbed. I read all of his books because it was so easy for me to read. Now, it's interesting because at my age, looking back and trying to reread the Foundation series, it's unreadable. It is the most horrendously written books out there. It is, I mean, the man is illiterate. It's almost impossible to read as an adult. But as a child, um, it seemed as though I was simpatico with his worldview. The Foundation series was this vast, expanding universe. And the main argument is that if you take like microsamples, like micro data, and you look at tens of thousands of years of human history, you understand that there are patterns that emerge. And then you can take these patterns and then mathematically model them and then create this framework in which you can actually predict what's going to happen. And there'll be different crisis points, and then there'll be different solutions to these crisis points. And even though there might be some divergences, but you always end up in the same place. Now, and this is true only because at the macro level, right? You're talking about like trillions of people in the Foundation world. You're talking about like tens of thousands of years, and that was his argument in the Foundation series. And that's an idea that stayed with me my entire life. My life took a sharp divergence when I went to Yale, okay, because I was a poor immigrant in Toronto, and I was a marginalized individual. And then I go to Yale, which is really the center of the universe, right? This is where all the children of the elite go. And even though I myself was not that successful at Yale, I was successful academically. I mean, I did well in school, but Yale's not a place where you go and learn knowledge. Yale is a place where you meet the connections, build the social network that will carry you for the rest of your life. So, classic example is George W. Bush. George W. Bush, when he went to Yale, he was a cheerleader and he was a C student, but he was on a first name basis with every one of his classmates at Yale, and they stayed together for, they stayed as friends for the rest of their lives. I met his roommate once. His roommate is Sandy Rand, and he was a lawyer in Hong Kong when I met him. And he went to Hotchkiss and went to Yale, and he ended up as George W. Bush's ambassador to Beijing when he was president. So it's a very close network, and I was a marginalized part of this network, but I absorbed a lot of their values. and a lot of their intellectual framework for the world. And basically, the framework, it's a very simple one in which that the best ideas always triumph, and the best individuals, the best talent will always triumph. And that's a story of history. It's a theological history towards progress, towards enlightenment. And that's something that I believe for the longest time. But then, after I graduated from Yale, I started to fail through life. And I started out as a high school teacher in Beijing. Then I worked as a journalist for the Chronicle of Higher Education. Then I became a documentary filmmaker. I also worked for the United Nations at some point. And then all this time, it was a long period of cognitive dissonance, which drove me into depression because I went to Yale and I believed that people are inherently good and that good will always triumph in the end. But then, working at the United Nations and seeing all this corruption, being in China and seeing all this incompetence, and just meeting people who are extremely successful. And then you're like, I don't know why they succeeded because these are mediocre individuals. So I had I myself was just floundering through life. Um, I, I wrote like 3 books, all of which failed. I was unemployed for the longest time. For like a couple of years, I was like literally living in my parents' basement playing StarCraft from like I think 6 p.m. until 5 a.m. I was like a vampire, and I lived my life like online, and but it felt safe because once I stepped outdoors, once I started to meet people, people confused me. The human world confused me because it was not the way that logically it was supposed to work. And so, um, after a long bout of depression, I started to begin to resurrect or develop a new understanding of how the world works. And at this time, I started to play poker. Okay, I played Texas Hold'em poker, and what I recognized is that when you play poker, when you play any game, it seems as though every individual has a distinct strategy of how to play this game. And this strategy you may not think is logical, but he's winning money, so it does work. All right, so there are different types of poker players, and I started to like study different games. And I recognized that wow, like in every game, you're gonna have a diversity, a range of strategies. And these strategies may not be optimal for you, but they're optimal for the other person. Okay. So humans are diverse and each person has an optimal strategy according to his personality, according to his circumstance. And so once I started to appreciate and apply psychology to game theory, and I started to have a much more nuanced and a much more realistic understanding of how the world works. And a major breakthrough was, like 6 years ago. I have a good friend. His name is David Bromwich, and he was my professor mentor at Yale. He's starting professor of English at Yale, and he's really the smartest man I know. And I made a point of staying in touch with him, like for decades. And we had these email exchanges because Trump had won the presidency, and there was all these DI politics at the universities at Yale that was confusing him. So we would have these like email conversations. And at first, he got in touch because he wanted to know what the cultural revolution was like in China. And I told him, like, what happened in the 70s in China is exactly what's happening right now in the United States on college campuses. And so we developed a very long, close email relationship. And then we started to transition to talk about geopolitics. We started to talk about why Putin invaded Ukraine. Will Trump win 2020? So we went through all this geopolitics. And then I recognized that whatever I was doing my entire life, the system of analysis that I developed, the intellectual framework I developed, had a good way of predicting how events would unfold. All right, so I predicted that Putin would invade Ukraine. I predicted that Trump would win 2020, but if he didn't win 2020, then he would run again in 2024 and he would win. I predicted the war in Iran, and so I was, in these email exchanges that I had, I'm very thankful for David Bromwich because, he really inspired me, really mentored me in this process. I recognized that I could I could explain why the world was working the way it was. And so a couple of years ago, I started to teach a class on geostrategy, on geopolitics, and I filmed it and I put it on YouTube. And I made certain predictions. For example, I predicted that Trump would win 2024. He would become president again. I predicted that Trump would attack Iran. I predicted that there'd be a civil war in America at some point, possibly by 2028. I predicted that Putin would win the war in Ukraine and he would move and capture Odessa. Okay, so these are all predictions that are turning out to be accurate, and that's what allowed me to blow up on the internet. So yeah. So I would say that my framework it's an appreciation that at the end of the day, human society is a game, and there are different players. And we have to understand the psychology of these major players, okay, people like Putin and Trump, if we are to understand how the world works. Because at the end of the day, it's not ideas that ultimately win out. It's these individuals that must play the game. And they're going to play the game that maximizes their best interests. And if we see the world that way, then I think it makes much more sense. So I've been using this analysis, game theory analysis, to understand geopolitics, and it's turned out pretty well. Okay, so most recently, I was on some geopolitical podcasts, and I kept on arguing that this American war in Venezuela makes absolutely no sense whatsoever. If you look at it from a game theory perspective, um, what Trump is doing doesn't really make any sense, because a lot of people are saying, well, he wants it for the oil. I'm like, well, if he wants the oil, he can just buy the oil, all right? And that's what's happening right now, where Delcy Rodriguez, the new president of Venezuela, is issuing new laws that make it much easier for the private ownership of Venezuela oil companies, the Venezuela oil sector. Okay, so he could have done that, like, before. Okay, and so I kept on saying that. But it was unclear to me why he was doing that, because I didn't have enough information to work with. I just knew, like, the standard geopolitical explanation that he wants the oil doesn't really make sense. Okay, and then what happened, of course, was that Maduro was kidnapped. Delta Force went in, blew a lot of stuff up, including the mausoleum of Hugo Chavez, and kidnapped Maduro, and they paraded him through the streets of New York. And then it clicked to me why this is happening. Okay, it clicked to me why they did this, and the answer is, first of all, Maduro must be a CIA asset, because there's no other explanation for how it was so easily done. It could have only been done with the cooperation of those inside. The idea that Delcy Rodriguez, the vice president, betrayed Maduro is just ridiculous, because this guy, Maduro, was in power for 13 years. So he has a political sense. I mean, he's not an idiot. I mean, he may be stupid if you talk to him about geopolitics, about mathematics. He doesn't know any of this stuff. But political survival, game theory, he understands a lot. And so I don't think anyone betrayed him. I think that he was always a CIA asset, because he had to be in order to survive that long. If he were not, they would have assassinated him a long time ago. And he had Cuban bodyguards, and basically they were there to keep him in prison. And Delta Force went in to extract him. They went to extricate him from the situation. And the deal is that Maduro will be put on trial. I don't know when. I mean, it's going to happen soon. And then Maduro is going to say two things. Okay, the first thing he's going to say is that Venezuela participates in drug smuggling, and therefore the Americans were right to arrest me for narco trafficking. Okay, this was a legitimate pretext for arresting me. And number two is, and this is the most important, is that he has evidence that the Democrats stole the 2020 election using Smartmatic machines. Okay, so Smartmatic machines are voting machines that they use in Venezuela, and he's going to tell you how it's possible to rig the Smartmatic machines, and then it's going to prove that, yes, the Democrats did steal the 2020 election. And in return, Trump's going to pardon him. Okay, both he and his wife were extricated from Venezuela, so it seems as though there was an agreement already in place. And so again, this is a prediction that I make, And we'll see in a month or two whether or not this prediction holds out. But again, like, this is game theory analysis to geopolitics, where before it's like, okay, it's just oil. No. What does Trump want? And what does Maduro want, right? Trump wants to overturn the 2020 election and get a third term, right? If he's able to prove to the American people that, in fact, the Democrats stole the 2020 election, then this justifies him running for a third term. And I think he will win by a landslide. I think that 2028, I would not be surprised if it was a Trump versus Obama matchup. And I would not, and in that situation, Trump would win easily. Okay, I guarantee you, if that were the matchup, Obama would be destroyed, especially with the release of the Epstein files, right?
Yeah.
So you have to ask yourself, what is happening? Why this Venezuela kidnapping of Maduro? Why the release of Epstein files, right? And if you just look at Trump as the player and he's trying to get a third term and he's trying to become king of the United States, then all this makes sense. Ultimately, his greatest enemy in achieving a third term are not the Democrats, it's a deep state. Okay, so from his perspective, it was not the Democrats who rigged the 2020 election, it was a deep state or a certain faction of the deep state that was financed by CIA drug money that allowed the Democrats to win, that allowed Joe Biden to win. And so he needs to attack these people. And you can do that through, Maduro. You can also do that through the Epstein files. You can also do that through Palantir and Peter Thiel, right? Getting them to overturn the deep state and install a new deep state. Okay, so that's what Donald Trump is doing, and so everyone thinks Donald Trump is an idiot. He may be an idiot. Okay, I mean, like, I think if you were to ask him to write a paper, a speech, it would be a terrible speech. But in terms of like personality politics, in terms of like political manipulation, in terms of like controlling optics, then I think he's the best in the world. I think he's a super athlete in terms of political manipulation and controlling political perception. Okay, and that's the idea of game theory. Like for him to be in this position, he needs to be the best at what he does. Okay, so ask yourself, what does he do really well, and what is his ambition? What are his motivations? What are his incentives? And what is optimal strategy? And if you look at it that way, then what he's doing makes perfect sense. And then you can extrapolate and make certain predictions in that. And I predict that he will win a third term. I predict that he will get a third term. In fact, I will go as far to say he will get a fourth term as well.
Fantastic. I mean, the references that many people have made to his time in the WWE, I think it is, in the professional wrestling scene, seem to be ringing very true in the way that he manages politics as a form of entertainment, in a way, as a story, as a show. I think you've mentioned this quite often in your lectures.
Okay, so I'll say this. Okay, I will say that politics was always a show. All right, so let me give an example. George H.W. Bush. George H.W. Bush is in the Epstein files, right? And the accusation against him is that he was organizing these, orgies that we saw in Eyes Wide Shut. Mm-hmm. And they're satanic rituals. And you know what? It fits his personality. Okay, so let's go into some basic background about George H.W. Bush. First of all, we can guess that he was the mastermind of Iran-Contra, right? Because Ronald Reagan is an actor, whereas George H.W. Bush was a deep state operative since he was a teenager. I mean, his family is CIA deep state, okay? The Bushes. And he went to Andover, and he was in Skull and Bones at Yale, okay? So he really is the secret Satan that controls America. Iran-Contra, he masterminded that, okay? Now, what's interesting is 1980s, a conduit for Iran-Contra, that's drug smuggling, was Arkansas. And who was governor of Arkansas at that time? Bill Clinton, right? And we know, I mean, this is well documented. Bill Clinton and George H.W. Bush are really good friends. In fact, if you talk to people who know the two, people will tell you that George H.W. Bush saw Bill Clinton as a son, much more so than his own son, George W. Bush. He actually saw George W. Bush as a bit of a failure. And here was Bill Clinton, who was very articulate, very charming. He had a great future. And George H.W. Bush really mentored Clinton. And so in 1992, when George H.W. Bush and Bill Clinton were on stage debating, it was a show, right? George H.W. Bush was perfectly happy to give the presidency to Bill Clinton because he's actually better off in the shadows, right? Why is it that of all the presidents, we know least about the presidential afterlife of George H.W., right? We know that Bill Clinton started the Clinton Foundation. We know that Obama started his foundation. We know that um, George H.W. Bush became a painter, right? But we know nothing about the afterlife, presidential afterlife of George H.W. And we can just assume that he went back to being a spy, to being this puppet master around the world, okay? So um, Bill Clinton was being mentored by George H.W. Bush. And, a lot of his policies, George H.W. would have enacted anyway, right? He was trying to enact them, like NAFTA and most favored nations trading status for China, this neoliberal agenda that was very much part of the Reagan Bush years, but he had problems implementing them because of all the pushback from the Democrats, right? People don't remember this, but the Democrats under Dave Gethard in the 1980s was a working class party that did not want immigrants, that did not want free trade, and did not believe that China would be a good trading partner because of China's blatant abuse of human rights. People forget all this, okay? So the Democrats were the polar opposite of the Republicans. And Bill Clinton was a perfect person to co-opt and destroy the Democratic Party from within, right? And make it more Republican. Okay, so you can say the Democrats have become Republican, the Republicans have become, MAGA. All right, but think about the cooperation between George H.W. Bush and Bill Clinton, where George H.W. could not have implemented his policies under Republican administration, but he could have done so through a Bill Clinton administration. Okay, that's point number one. Point number two is, okay, so his son wins, and his son won because of the Supreme Court, right? So I think Senator Dale O'Connor was the deciding vote, and so I'm sure his father made some phone calls. But what happens right after his son wins? 9/11 happens, okay? And who's the only person in the world who could have orchestrated 9/11? George H.W. Bush, right? Because it was always people in place, including Donald Rumsfeld, Dick Cheney, all these people were his people in place. And if you just look at the Epstein files and the sort of like the complicated satanic rituals that he organized, yeah, he's sort of a person to sort of like think that 9/11 is he would want to orchestrate something like 9/11, okay? And of course you have the war on terror. But then 2004, that presidential election was very interesting as well because who were the candidates? John Kerry for the Democrats, George W. Bush for the Republicans. Guess what? They're both skull and bones, right? And who's the leader of skull and bones? George H.W., okay? So no matter what would have happened, he would have won. And the policies would have continued, okay? Right? So you could, and then who comes next? Obama. I'm not sure if you know anything about Obama, but his family is clearly CIA. If his family is clearly CIA, then he's another puppet of George H.W. Bush. All right? Yeah. So it's just one continuous regime, one continuous set of policies. Yeah. But of course, the major disruption was Donald Trump. All right? But so if you go back to Ronald Reagan up until Obama, it's just one clear ideological framework for how geopolitics should be run. And whenever they ran into stumbling blocks, they found a candidate that could remove these stumbling blocks, right? So Bill Clinton removed the left working class objections to this regime. Then Obama was able to remove the liberal objections, right? Because remember,
through identity politics.
Exactly, right? Because remember, why do we have identity politics? Because of Occupy Wall Street, right? Because 2008, the entire global elite showed how corrupt, how incompetent they were by basically destroying the global economy. And then Occupy Wall Street. Occupy Wall Street was a real thing. It had a revolutionary tenure to it, and Obama was brought in to implement identity politics. Okay, and so that's how the system works. So it's always been like this.
So there's a few threads that I want to bring together from what you've spoken about so far. The first is that the vast majority of the population they grow up with certain stories about the way the world works, certain that they build into their self-concept, that they create as assumptions. Like you mentioned, like you work hard, and you will get ahead, you'll be rewarded, this sort of thing. And the other is that in reality, these stories are all part of the show that people are indoctrinated into. And behind the scenes, the world works in a much more uh, almost incomprehensible way in our knowledge of the way that consciousness works. But also, that is not necessarily just a positive sense of higher consciousness, that this uh, higher consciousness can lend itself towards evil use or immoral use. And that's what I have sort of understood from the threads that you draw through your lectures of when you've spoken about ancient practices of religious indoctrination and the origins of secret societies all the way through to their modern secular forms in the intelligence agencies who are the indoctrinators of the modern secular world, and their studies into mind control through programs that we know about, such as MK Ultra, and I'm sure many, many others that we don't know about. Could you speak to a bit about the implications of what that means for the sort of facade of the world that we think we see and the actual nature of reality going on behind it?
Yeah, great. Okay, yeah. So the best metaphor to use in this instance is thinking about Plato's Allegory of the Cave.
Yeah.
Okay, so in Plato's Allegory of the Cave, everyone's, well, like most people, are prisoners and they're chained to the ground, and their necks are shackled, so they can't move around. Okay, and the only thing they can stare at is a wall, right? And the rulers of this world, what they do is they have this fire behind everyone, and this fire, they have these puppets, and these puppets then project onto the wall. All right, and that's a perfect metaphor to understand the world we live in, where reality is a manifestation of our perceptions. Okay, consciousness is what gives rise to reality. If you want to create reality, then you have to be able to control and direct the consciousness of the majority of people. Okay, and that's what the elite do. Ever since the beginning of time, right? So before, these people were called priests, right? What's the job of priests? Priests were to create a narrative about the world that controlled and directed people's consciousness so that this reality could be manifested with the priest at the very center. And this is no different from the world we live in today. Why do we have schools? Why do we have media? Why do we have the internet? And the point is to conjure the consciousness of everyone in order to manifest a reality that benefits the elite. And what's the purpose of this reality? Ultimately, the purpose of this reality is to extract energy from people, because that's the real wealth in the universe, right? If the entire universe is consciousness, then the real wealth is the capacity to direct and extract this consciousness and direct in a way that benefits you. Okay, and so another way of saying this is attention. Like, if you can direct people's attention, then you have all the power in the world. Okay, and there are different mechanisms that you can use to direct attention. So the most easy, the most universal way is money, right? Because money has a way of focusing your attention on trying to obtain as much of it as possible. And then to support this idea, where money is the center of the universe, is the entire media ecosystem, where when you read the news, like, read it very carefully, right? It's always like GDP. Okay, what matters is GDP, how much money was made. It's not about happiness. It's not about well-being. It's not about spirituality. It's about GDP. Okay, it's about human life. Okay, so human life is an economic commodity. So it's not about the quality of life you live. It's not about how creative or imaginative you are. It's about, like, like, your life is a set economic unit. If you die, then that's a downgrade of GDP. Okay, so the entire world is to focus your attention on money and make you believe that money is God, that money is the end all and be all, and that's the world we live in today. And but what's key to understand is that, actually, you know what, money can go away. You don't really need money. But what you still need is to be able to direct and control people's attention. And that's why there are these fail safes in the system. Okay, and so the classic example is artificial intelligence, right? Why are they spending so much money on developing artificial intelligence? Is it really so that you can generate porn videos online so you can watch it? Is it really so that you have an AI girlfriend? No, the point is that once money is gone, you need a new god to replace money, and that has to be artificial intelligence, a mechanism or device that can control your entire perception. Okay, so imagine, you know, like you're online and this computer's talking to you. And I met people, I have friends who tell me like this AI is real. And like I'm trying to explain to them, no, it's not real. It's a goddamn hallucination. Okay, all AI is just statistical modeling. That's all it is. You're being fooled, and they don't get it. It's impossible to explain. No, it's real. I talk to him. I talk to the AI, and the AI understands me. Okay, so I mean that's the failsafe. Once the money system is gone, then you create a world in which, you know, everyone lives in his own individual matrix. Okay, it's like literally that. And like you spend all your time online talking to your AI girlfriend and talking to God, who will tell you how to live a better life. And what they don't understand is that behind this AI, it's like the Wizard of Oz. It's just like this old guy, like, you know, talking to you. Okay, and it could be like literally, you know, like literally, it could be like millions of Indians in a warehouse somewhere talking to you, and you think it's God. You think you're literally talking to like Natalie Portman or someone, or like Audrey Hepburn, who's been brought back from the dead. All right. So yeah, I mean, like the problem of consciousness is that, you know, it's beautiful. It leads to massive creativity. The problem of consciousness is like we cannot differentiate reality from fantasy. All right. We just can't do it. So once this AI system is in place, then we all become prisoners in Plato's cave.
Also, there's several key elements to, if you add into this understanding, which will show people that the way technology has developed all throughout the scientific rational age probably is not accidental as well. In the sense of like the reason why smartphones have developed in the way they have is a deliberate understanding of the way to capture people's attention, to keep them distracted, to keep them divided, and to keep them reactive emotionally. Just as most people don't realize that the internet and Google were products of the military and the CIA deliberately to be able to collect data and to sort it and to be able to filter through it and use it for, you know, whatever purposes they wanted to. And in a similar sense,
Sorry, I hate to interrupt, but I would go deeper and say that science itself was a creation of the Freemasons,
that's what I
right?
was
So
about to
the Royal
say. Yes.
Society, yeah, Isaac Newton, they're all Freemasons, right?
Well, because what science does is it's one of its like biggest coups was that it wiped away previous history and put on top of it a new interpretation of our place in the world that was purposeless and seemingly random.
Yep.
So it hid a lot of the deliberate machinations that were happening.
Exactly. So evolution, right? The theory of evolution. It's a really problematic theory, but like think about how in like 20 years time it was able to conquer all of the world, right? So like in 20 years time, all schools were teaching the theory of evolution, and like you're not allowed to create like it's the most dominant theory in the world. And if like you ever question evolution, say it's like, did we really evolve from apes? People would just think you're insane. People would just think that you're this, you know, this retard. Okay, it's so embedded in our everyday reality, like this theory of evolution. Yeah.
Well, also, it means that people, I think we lost as a population an understanding of what it actually means to advance your consciousness, whether that's spiritually or in a secular sense, because I have, you know, beginner experience in some of the Eastern religious traditions, and it is very clear that it is possible for people to advance their consciousness into the interpersonal and interplanetary cosmic realms. But if that is not done in a healthy way, it can also end up with people who are actually very advanced in the power of their minds, but who have dark psychological, pathological shadows, which
Yep.
are then incorporated into the way they see the world. And I have a sense that this is what has been happening with the secret societies for a long period of time, in that they have attained certain powers over the mind, and they have sought about using them for, because also there is the, I think I've taken this from your lectures as well. If you understand that the nature of what we think to be reality is not true, and that there is a sort of a nomina or a monad, and that what happens in this realm is actually not as important as what happens in the monad, then that gives you the, if you're immorally inclined, that gives you the license to behave however you want in this world. And
Exactly.
so,
Yeah, you're exactly right. And this goes back to the allegory of the cave, right? Where one person escapes and he goes into the monad, the nomana, and he sees reality for what it is, just pure consciousness, pure light. And at this point, he has three options, right? The first option is to just stay where he is, but he doesn't do that because he feels pity for the people below him. So he goes down. Second option is to go down and tell the truth to people, and then people just laugh at him, right? And this leads to a third option, which is like, well, why not just use this against people? You know, if you know the truth, then you are the one-eyed man in the kingdom of the blind, right? You can do whatever you want, and that's what the people in power understand. Like, if I understand that mind is everything, consciousness is everything, then I'm able to use this against people because they don't understand this. People understand. People think that money is everything. But like, what matters is who prints the money, who creates the money, who controls the money, right? That's what matters. It doesn't matter how much money you have. Like, you have $1 trillion of like fake money. Good for you, right?
Yeah. So that takes me on to a question that I'd like to direct more to the Western audience. We've spoken a bit about the deeper currents of thought and belief systems within society that linger on for millennia or hundreds of years at the least. But we in the scientific rational age kind of dismiss them as being outdated or as if we have progressed beyond them. And there was one particularly impactful period in the Protestant Reformation, which you've spoken about, where this question of how do I know if I'm being a true believer to God came up, and there was three answers that were created to that. There was the Calvinist work ethic, the breaking of taboos, and I think the third one was the inner assurance and self introspection. You've spoken about the first two in particular and how they sort of linger. We see them showing up in society these days, really shaping the way that we, hail rich people because they seem to have gained the grace of God. And you've spoken also about the breaking of taboos as being more involved in some of the secret societies activities as their way of showing their fealty to nobody but God. What I don't see showing up in our society is the third answer so much, the inner assurance through self scrutiny. Um, do you have any understanding of why that worked out the way it did? That two of the answers to that question were very powerful and successful, and the third answer did not gain much traction?
Yeah, right. Well, it's because the idea of individuality, right? The idea of individual creativity is the greatest threat to the system, because your
Mm-hmm.
greatest act of rebellion is to deny the reality before you and establish your own reality. If everyone did that, the system would collapse, right? So an act of rebellion is not to overturn the regime, because because if that ever happened, you would just be the new regime doing whatever they did before, right? That's why we feel there's continuity in the system, even though we know for a fact that these dynasties, these individuals have changed over time. So the idea, like I've heard conspiracy theorists say that, this goes back to the 13 families of Rome. This goes back to Venice. This goes back to the Knights Templars. This is all nonsense. This is not how humans behave. But the ideas pass on from generation to generation. The idea of how to construct a reality in which you are able to enslave the majority of people, that's stay with us. And according to game theory, like, even if this knowledge were not to be passed on, whoever's in charge would just build a system like that, because that is optimizing his interests. Okay, so it feels as though it's continuous, but it's not. So the only way out of this is for us as individuals, because we all have a connection to the higher consciousness, to the monad, is for us to embrace this consciousness and to reject what is before us. Okay, to reject money, to reject materialism, to reject status, and say that what matters to me is my own creativity. What matters to me is my impact on others around me, my generosity, my openness, my kindness. By acting with generosity, I change the world for the better. Okay, and that's a secret because people talk about like a holographic universe, right? What is a
Mhm.
holographic universe? All the universe is reflected in us, and so we have the capacity to change the universe for the better or for the worse for our own individual actions. And once we embrace our unique individuality, once we embrace our the power of our consciousness, and once we understand our own responsibility to the universe, then we have to participate in the world in a way that benefits everyone. And that is the greatest act of rebellion. And it's actually an act that requires the most courage. Because what
Mhm.
you're talking really about is abandoning your family, abandoning your friends, abandoning the society that you grew up in. Okay, it's like basically jumping off a cliff and expecting to land, right? But like no, you've been taught that if you jump off a cliff, you're gonna die, but you know in your heart that when you jump off the cliff, you're just gonna fly, and like if you said that to people would just think you're crazy.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, this week, it seems that people are being pushed in this direction, uh, whether they like it or not, through the things that we're finding out about the world through the Epstein files, where a lot of people describe like you couldn't make this up as if it was a movie script. Things seem to be playing out in a almost theatrical way that is so shocking as to force people to start waking up. Um, I know that there's many people in the spiritual world who see this as a almost divine intervention style of period that we're going through. But it does seem quite clear that there is a level of waking up into responsibility for ourselves that we are passing through. Um, I actually started to notice this through Osama bin Laden's letter to America, which the deep state did a great job of trying to uh, repress when it came up again at the beginning of the genocide in Gaza. But what his one of his main messages to Americans in that was, you need to take responsibility for the actions of your government as citizens if you want to claim to be a democracy, because under your democratic logic, you are electing the people that will carry out policies on your behalf. And if this is what they're going to do to our people, these are the consequences you can expect to see. So in a sense, it was an original wake up call that he gave. There's so much about his links to the CIA and other things that I won't go into now, but in some ways, these type of events call us to wake up to the reality that we live in.
Yeah, so I think the greatest shock of Epstein files is people recognize that the elite, they're not special. Okay, they're
Mm,
not. They're smart. They're not smarter. They're not moral. They're not more. No, they're not more moral. They're not more competent. Okay, they can't even spell properly. Okay, and that's the great truth of this world. The people in positions of power are there because they were born into positions of power. That's something that I discovered when I went to Yale. I go to Yale and I'm expecting like this, this heaven of intellectual brilliance, and it's not. Even the professors were mediocre. They were just like, like I was like, oh my god, this is like my high school, but it's bigger. That's all it is, and so like, and that's what people need to recognize, that the elite are just you and me. Okay, the only difference is they have all the power, and power corrupts. And so like I was talking to my wife about why Jeffrey Epstein was doing what he was doing. Like why are they doing this? Because like it's disgusting. And her explanation makes the most sense. So, my wife, she's not from a powerful family, but she grew up in a very powerful organization. And from her early age, she's dealt with powerful people. Okay. So she knows what they're like. Okay. And she explained to me how they are. Okay. So the powerful people are usually born into positions of privilege. And if you're like that, There's no excitement in your life. There's no challenge. There's no, it's only just privilege. And privilege is boring, it's numbing. Okay. So for them, the greatest challenge is how do you find excitement? How do you stir a feeling in your heart in this world? Her explanation is you do it for children. Okay. Why? Well, first of all, it's like having a doll, right? A doll you can play with, a cat you can play with. But children are much more exciting. You can play with them, you can control them, you can manipulate them, you can abuse them. And the other thing is that you can scare children much more easily. Okay, so there's conspiracy theory where the elite draw energy from adrenochrome. Okay,
Mm-hmm.
uh, and adrenochrome. Okay, and adrenochrome is just blood that is excited, blood that comes from fear. Okay,
Mm.
and if you and so you drink that blood because this blood is rejuvenating. Well, that's a metaphorical statement where as a powerful person and you see a child in fear, that excites you. That excites you both sexually and psychologically and emotionally. And so you have seen these videos of like Prince Andrew just running around and grabbing children, and he was like really really excited, really really happy when he's doing that. And the reason why is that's the only thing that can bring him excitement. Another example is a Squid Game. I'm not sure if you've seen the Netflix series, The Squid Game, right? The entire
Yeah.
premise of the Squid Game is you have all these rich people in South Korea, and they have like the most money in the world. They can do whatever they want. They can like sleep with the most beautiful movie star in the world. They don't want to do that because it's boring. Okay, they're looking for some excitement in their life, and that's why they create the Squid Game. All right, so the Squid Game is just a metaphor for Epstein Island, where people are just these people are bored, man. They're bored by everything. They're bored by their own lives. They're bored by the people around them because they're all psychopaths. They're bored by power itself because they've experienced it all, and so like they're looking for like novelty in their lives, and that's what children bring. Okay, there's also and it's like, why are they so blatant about this? And my wife says it's psychology where you have to have a risk of getting caught. You have to have the risk of being exposed in order for this to be exciting. Okay,
Mm-hmm.
if it's all just hidden from everyone and no one can ever find out, and there's no risk, it's not funny. It's not fun anymore. Right? So I understand this sounds really disturbing, but unfortunately, if you give a certain group of people too much power, then this is the way they behave, and this has been true historically. Okay, you look at any society in China. Guess what, guys? We do the same thing. All right. Don't think that Chinese are more superior because of Confucianism. Don't think that the Indians are superior because of their Vedic tradition. No, everyone's the same. If you put people in positions of power, they're going to abuse it. All right. And what they want ultimately is novelty, excitement, feeling. All right. So, like just you and me, we feel a tremendous rush when we achieve something. Well, they've achieved it all. So they need these sort of like sadistic, satanic rituals in order to feel alive again. Look, the other thing that is not being in the Epstein files, but I'm sure there's lots of them, are snuff films. Okay.
Mm.
I'm sure there's lots of these things because that's what they do, man.
Yep. Yeah. I can't help but feel like I mean, I know this is repeated through all cultures and ages, but it does seem to have some links to the broader cultural malaise and lack of meaning that we see in the West currently. Where you kind of mentioned this in your lecture about gerontocracy, where we have a class of people who are at the top of the society who do not want to budge. They control all the wealth, um, and they're a bit uncreative. But this seems to me to be a representation of where the society is at in general. The whole Western society seems geriatric in a sense. And there's some other things that you mentioned about the Anglosphere in your lectures, I think starting with Shakespeare, but you mentioned it with some of the other great English literature works, that English as a language has this propensity to be used with a lot of dazzle and show, but with less actual substantive meaning to it in comparison to other languages. And we know that language shapes the way our mind works in particular. Um, so I wanted to ask you if is there something that you've seen in the Anglosphere and in the English language in particular that has led itself towards this society that lacks any meaning. It can produce great orators and people with a lot of entertainment value, but not actually any real ideas or contribution to civilization.
Yeah, I think I think a lot of it stems from the fact that Britain was an island, right? And
Hmm.
as an island, you're very provincial, you're very insular in the way you perceive the world. And when Britain became an empire, it didn't become more cosmopolitan. It didn't become much more deep and insightful. It just spread its island mentality throughout the world, including the Anglosphere, right? So you go to Australian, these are pretty provincial people. You could go to Canada,
Yeah.
pretty provincial, man. I grew up in Canada. These are pretty stupid people. And like you see the same in Australia as well, right? So
Yeah, we do.
it isn't like, okay, we're not an empire and we need to be much more cosmopolitan. We need to create a cosmopolitan culture. No, it's not like, no. They just spread their island mentality throughout the world.
Hmm. Because I feel like this is part of what is showing up in the sort of social crises of the West as well, in that there's the mental health crises, loneliness, individualism. For young men, the highest cause of death is diseases of despair. Um, and is this an inevitable, dead end for Western consumer society, or have you seen or thought of any ways that the Western world could restore meaning to its people and to its, civilizational direction and purpose?
Yeah, I think this is the end. And I'm extremely pessimistic about this. I think that we're headed to about 100 years of like permanent decline. And this is very similar to the Bronze Age collapse, where unfortunately one system of thought, like this consumer liberal democracy, has conquered the world, right? So Francis Fukuyama talks about this in the end of history, where there's really no other competing ideology against consumer liberal democracy, and it's really conquered the world, including China. Okay, including China. Yes, I understand China is an authoritarian society, but it has a lot of the basic worldview of the consumer liberal democratic mentality, which is like the consumer is everything. Money is what matters. Materialism is all that matters. Okay, so this idea has really conquered the world, and unfortunately, um, there can't be another system that could replace this system. Okay, so what's going to happen is this system is going to fracture, and so we're living in a time when we've reached the peak of globalization, and it's amazing to think about. Okay, but think about how I could be sitting in China and I could be making money in the United States, and this money from the United States is wired immediately to my bank account in China, converted from US dollars to RMB immediately. And I can use this to go to the store and buy avocados from Mexico. I
Mm.
can use it to buy cherries from Chile. Okay, it's just an incredible system that we have. And like tomorrow, if I want, I could board a plane and go to Maldives to scuba dive and pay it all
Hmm.
with a Chinese credit card. It's amazing the system we have, but it's not sustainable because it doesn't provide any meaning to the world. It's one of decadence. It's one of corruption. It's one that's anti-human because again, we're consciousness. We're here on this world to expand the consciousness of ourselves as well as the universe, and that means a, a life of struggle, hardship, and pain. I'm sorry to say this, but that's the life we should live, and instead we've chosen a life of easy luxury, decadence, corruption. Okay, we choose the easier path rather than the harder path, even though the only path to enlightenment, the only path to wisdom is through the harder path by climbing a mountain. And so the universe is going to punish us for this, okay? Because this is not why we're here. And the universe is like, okay, guys, if you want to play this game, then we're going to play this game, okay? So the big thing to watch out for is something called the magnetic pole excursion. And the magnetic pole excursion is going to basically reset the game. It's going to destroy the world. 99% of us will be dead in about 50 years' time. And like listen, like just go on the net and like look at Antarctica. And if you melt all the ice, what happens? You find it's actually 2 or 3 different continents together, okay? And if you keep on looking further, you'll find some ancient structures there. Go to Amazon. There's lots of ancient structures in the Amazon, okay?
Mm.
Biologists believe the Amazon was man-made, actually. You go to Göbekli Tepe, okay? So look, humans have been around for about 200,000 years. We have about 10,000 years of our history. I
Mm.
cannot believe that these 200,000 years we're just hunter-gatherers, roaming the a frozen world. Look, they built Katai Hoyak in a few decades. You go to like any society and like they're very quickly able to build cities if they put their minds to it. Okay, so we're not the first great civilization. And the idea that, this is all theological and that we've reached the peak of human civilization, it's not true. Go look at the pyramids, man. We have absolutely no idea how they built the pyramids. And we couldn't even do the pyramids ourselves, okay? What's amazing to think about is that there are other human civilizations that existed before us. And in many ways, they're much more advanced than us. They're so much more advanced that we can't even imagine what they were like, okay? Just as they can't imagine what we're like today, we can't even imagine what they were like before. And so
Mm.
that's a greatness of human civilization, where if consciousness is the universe, we can manifest reality in any way that we imagine. And we put our collective minds to it, and we have the correct values, then we create the greatest civilization on Earth. So we create the civilization because of our material greed, right? Whereas
Yep.
before, maybe before, they create their civilizations based on a spiritual, on spiritual enlightenment. All right, so you look at the Harappan civilization, right? The Indus Valley civilization, extremely peaceful, egalitarian, and spiritual. And so we're able to create any civilization that we want. And the problem today is we've created a material, greedy civilization that can only destroy us, and it's destroying us spiritually. I think never before in human history have people been so depressed, so lonely, so hopeless.
Yeah, I think this is an important point to just draw out from what some of the examples you've given and what we've spoken about previously today is that um, but whether it's on the individual level all the way through to the global level, talking about globalization, the further we live at a distance from reality, the further into delusions we live about ourselves or about the world, the harder the crash is when those delusions turn out to be wrong. So
That's exactly right.
globalization, you can sense just in the very menial way of like, I can buy fruit from all around the world at any time of the year, at any time of the day. That gives me a sense of, abundance or luxury that is actually built on false, frail structures that can collapse. And we have been kicking the can down the road of that delusion for so long that the collapse is going to be very hard. And just as in an individual life, it is usually only when people reach rock bottom that they actually start to wake up and they may turn towards spirituality and start to reflect upon themselves. It feels like that is what we're going to have to go through collectively to return to a more wholesome way of living in the world.
And the reality is that most of us will not be able to do this, okay? So what's going
Yes.
to kill us is not these natural disasters or war or famine. What's going to kill us is our incapacity to be resilient, our
Mm.
incapacity to be open-minded. And I think that's what's going to kill most people.
And it's particularly the biggest vulnerability in the Western world, which retains very little sense of spiritual faith. Because I've spent a lot of time in my professional life living in and working in places like Lebanon, Jordan, and Syria, where um, practiced daily faith was a huge component of the way people have dealt with difficulties and maintained social cohesion for decades now, or centuries really. And that shows me that, when everything in life comes crumbling down, what do you draw on to get up and get on with the day? That is something that I don't see anywhere in the Western world.
And the classic example is the Palestinians. They've been for everything, okay? And in the
Yep.
Israeli mindset, these people should be in Egypt right now, right? Why are they still around? So they've been, bombed. There's absolutely no reason for them to go on. But they're having more children, and that's the power of faith. and that's why they're so resilient. That's why they can't be defeated.
That's right. So just as a final question, I would like to, we've spoken so much about like a pulling away of these delusions and stories that people live within. Do you see any, like, I know you've already said you're relatively pessimistic about this, but it, is there any chance that with the development of AI, we move from we sort of replace the knowledge economy that we live in today in advanced societies with AI, and because there is not a lot left to do mentally, that we could return to actually working on the soul and the earth and the things that we need to sustain ourselves. Um,
Yeah.
yeah, I'd like to hear your thoughts about that.
Right. So AI doesn't mean more leisure time. It means the enslavement of mankind. It means the capturing of all conscious energy, right? So the idea of AI is to create a surveillance state where you're microchipped, where everything is digital ID, digital currency. Wherever you go, your movement is monitored. And if you're doing anything that is slightly wrong, you're nudged in the right direction. Okay. So maybe your internet goes off or your bank account is frozen. Okay. So it's complete 100% surveillance. It's a matrix, and it's meant to enslave us. And it's like, again, Plato's Allegory of the Cave, where you're literally now chained down and you can only stare at a screen. You can only see what people want you to see. That's what AI is. It's the idea of, like, AI is like freedom from work, and it will free us up for more, spiritual endeavors. That's just complete nonsense. It's gaslighting. That's not what it
Yeah,
is. All right.
yeah. I
Look,
think
look,
people
look,
need
look,
to
look. I
remember
live in
that.
China, man. I know what it is. I've seen the future, and it's China.
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, I often reference to people that they should go back and watch the Jetsons, the cartoon from the 50s and 60s. That was sort of the original propaganda about what technology would lead us to, that we would have all this leisure time and the robots would be doing the work. But nobody actually really asks, where is that today? They don't see that technological development is, from an economic perspective, just about replacing the cost of humans. And yeah, and then once we're not necessary, then that becomes about figuring out ways to control us.
Right. And look, I mean, a book everyone should read is Brave New World. Okay, because
Yeah.
that is the future, right? So the drugs will be a very important part of this new world as well, new world order as well, where it's not just AI surveillance, it's also like drugs, right? So if you take vaccines, you don't know what they put in there, right? You don't know what they put in fast foods. You don't know what they put in the water, but trust me, it's not good.
Mm-hmm. I think I have a question. Maybe some of your audience would like to hear as well. Is like, how do your students respond to your teaching? This is not a orthodox history class that they're getting into at such a young age, and I know a lot of people are sort of reliving their high school years through your lectures in a very enlightening way. um, how do you see your students' attitude to the world uh, changing after what they're learning?
So the reality is that most students zone out. They don't even come to class. All right. So I'm at like 16 students a class, but like maybe one or two will show up. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
But those one or two show up, their lives are changed forever because, they'll go home, they'll ask their parents, like, I learned this in class, and what do you think? And, they'll like it's going to force them to think much more deeper about the world. It's going to force them to be much more observant about the world, and it's going to open their minds. And that's the point of this education. I make a lot of mistakes in my teachings, because I'm dealing with so much material, and
Yeah.
a lot of what I'm doing is intuitive. I'm not like a research scholar where I spend like years researching a topic to make sure every detail is correct. I'm much more intuitive. I'm just trying to speculate about how the world would work. I'm driven a lot, and you can probably tell this in my lectures. I'm driven by my own curiosity, right? Because, like, I don't know these people. I don't know if this stuff is true or not. I'm just doing a thought experiment in my head, like okay, how can we explain what happened. And so I'm really much more interested in teaching thought processes than I am about teaching, the truth of the world.
Fantastic. Well, I personally, and I'm sure many others, really appreciate your contributions, and we'll be looking forward to seeing how you track developments in the coming months and years. And let's hope we all make it through this as safely and sanely as possible.
Look. If you want to make it through, you will. Okay, a lot of it is pure will, and unfortunately, what we've been trained to believe is that we're powerless. We're not. We are capable of we are capable of creating our own reality, and so it's really about your desire to be resilient. And a lot of your desire to be resilient just based on what you think the point of life is. If you think the point of life is to make as much money as possible, well, guess what? You won't survive the coming crises. But if you think that the point of your existence is to learn as much as possible, to seek wisdom, to seek enlightenment, to help others do as well as to do as well. Well, this coming age of darkness, it's for you a time for you a time for you to shine.
Fantastic. Thank you for that message. I'm sure everyone appreciates it. Thank you very much for your time today, Dr. Jiang. We'll hope to speak again soon in the future.
Okay, thank you, Alex.
Thanks.